that witching hour. So while that goes, got it. And then we will start the webinar and let folks come on in.
Let them join, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's going perfect. Folks are coming in. It's going, and that's going. Woo! I think I pushed, oh, nope, there's a button I forgot to push. There's always the one button.
There's always one.
The important one. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We are so excited to welcome Jane Kirkpatrick back to our virtual space alongside Crystal Alegria of the Extreme History Project to talk about Jane's new book, Beneath the Bending Skies. I'm your host, Jessica, here at the Country Bookshelf on the ancestral unceded land of the Apsáalooke Crow, Kootenai, Bitterroot Salish, Cheyenne, Shoshone-Bannock, Achéti-Chacoan, Kalispel Pend-d'Oreille, South Piikani Blackfeet, Northern Cheyenne, Chippewa Cree, Assiniboine, Anahi, Gravant, and Dakota peoples, among many others. And you will probably hear some more, spoiler alert, about many of these peoples as we go through the night. But we encourage those of you joining us from outside of Montana to learn more about the land that you occupy and the stories of its peoples. Jane probably has a book about it. So I will be dropping links in the chat periodically to, if you haven't purchased your copy of Beneath the Bending Skies or any of Jane's other books, you can click on those links. If you didn't add a copy of the book to your registration, look for that link as well. We are live streaming our event tonight. So if you're having trouble with audio or anything like that, if you visit the Country Bookshelf YouTube channel, you can find a live stream of the event there as well. Importantly, if you have questions for our author or for Crystal, please drop them in the Q&A drop them in the Q&A section, which is the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also leave them in the chat. We'll get to them as time allows. But you can type it in there as we go, as it sort of bubbles up, and then we'll get to them at the end. And of course, alongside some of those tech issues, you can also try exiting and re-entering the webinar. If that doesn't fix it, go to the YouTube channel and check things out there. I do like to remind everyone that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain welcoming for everyone who's joined us today. So offensive or inappropriate questions or comments will see the user dismissed from the space. But now for the good part. Jane Kirkpatrick is the New York Times and CBA bestselling and award-winning author of more than 40 books, including Something Worth Doing, One More River to Cross, Everything She Didn't Say, All Together in One Place, A Light in the Wilderness, The Memory Weaver, and many more, including A Sweetness to the Soul, which won the prestigious Wrangler Award from the Western Heritage Center. Her works have won the Willa Literacy Award, the Carol Award for Historical Fiction, and she was the 2016 Will Rogers Gold Medallion Award winner. She's also been shortlisted for the Christie, the Spur, and Oregon Book Awards, and she divides her time between Central Oregon and California with her husband, Jerry, and Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, who we may hear, but most likely not, but sometimes he likes to say hello. And then we are so excited to welcome Crystal with us this evening. Crystal is the Executive Director of the Extreme History Project and has worked in the field of public history and archaeology education for the past 20 years at a variety of museums and heritage organizations, always with the goal of bringing history and archaeology to the public. She co-founded the Extreme History Project with Marcia Fulton in 2012. Her research interests include community history, women's history, Western social history, the history of place, archaeology education, participatory action research, and public archaeology. Crystal has a BS in anthropology and an MA in history from Montana State University. Go Bobcats. And she has developed numerous walking tours and written blogs and articles on the history of the West, and speaks on women's history, cemetery symbolism, and Montana's early diversity. So if you haven't taken one of those tours, those of you that are in Bozeman, I highly recommend. We just missed the spooky season tours, but there are a few more on the schedule, and you can follow, much like you follow Country Bookshelf on Eventbrite, you can follow Extreme History Project there as well to stay up to date on all of their wonderful tours and things that they have going on. She obviously now calls Bozeman home and is lucky to share her journey with her husband Larry and 2 children, Emily and Lawson. Jane and Crystal, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for including us to be here. It's just really great.
Absolutely. Well, I am going to turn everything over to you guys. I'll be back to share questions from the audience here in a little bit. But Jane, take us away.
Okay. Well, I get to ask the first question of Crystal. One of the ways that this discussions have been set up is by usually pairing the author with another author or another person of great interest for the subject. And so when Jessica recommended you all, I thought that was great. I went to the website and tried to find out more about the Extreme History Project. And I would love it if you talk a little bit more about what your vision has been and your participation in history. I, of course, have great interest in women's history and history of the West. And so I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the Extreme History Project before we get into my book.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Jane, and thanks, Jessica, and thanks to the Country Bookshelf for hosting this tonight. I'm so excited to participate. I just loved your book, Jane, Beneath the Bending Skies, and I can't wait to dive in, but I will talk a little bit about Extreme History Project. So like Jessica said, we founded, a colleague and I, Marcia Fulton, founded Extreme History in 2012, just for the purpose of bringing history to the public and doing more engaging history that really makes it relevant to our lives today. And it has a kind of a tie, Jane, to your book a little bit as well, because Marcia and I met when we were doing the research of Fort Parker, which is an Indian agency for the Crow, for the Alegria Nation that is located near Livingston, Montana. That's just outside of Livingston, Montana. And so that's kind of how we met and started talking about our shared interest in history, and really started thinking about history and really bringing out history that hasn't been told before. Some of those historical narratives that have been suppressed intentionally or unintentionally. And so we started with this work on Fort Parker, and then it really just blossomed into this whole organization called the Extreme History Project. And so we do a lot of different things. We do walking tours, we have a lecture series, we do a podcast called The Dirt on the Past, which is really fun. And a colleague and I, Nancy Mahoney, do that podcast together. And then we do a lot of other workshops and things. We do a lot just to bring history to the people and really get it out to the public. And so we just did a documentary also called The Story of Us, the Women Who Shaped Montana. So women's history is really near and dear to my heart too. So, and of course, Mary Ronan is one of those women who is such an important figure in Montana history. So, so that's a little bit about extreme history and what we do and how we do it and why we do it.
So that has actually some of the germs of why I write fiction about women from the past. Virginia Woolf said that women's history must be invented, both uncovered and made up. And I always love that because a good biography, this is sort of my theory, a good biography says what someone did and when they did it. if you can find that in the record. But it doesn't tell you what the motivation might have been for that particular woman doing what she did. And it doesn't tell you how they might have felt. And fiction is the realm of emotional connection. But I think really good nonfiction, really good biography also moves us, and I think that's the work it sounds like you're doing, is finding ways to capture the history that might have been suppressed or just lost, and then gets restored, but also the emotional connection of what was going on that was lost. And so that was a big part of my discovery of this book. It was a memoir. It was Mary's memoir that really intrigued me, and it stayed with me, even though I read it many years ago. But it stayed with me in part because of things that she didn't say, that I wanted to explore more of. And at the same time, it was such a fascinating journey, and she was a really fine writer. I've heard from several readers who have gone online and have gotten that memoir, Girl from the Gulches, and have really enjoyed it. And that's part of the pleasure too of writing about real people, is that often there is some personal history, or there's some public history that people can access. And do their own kind of research and extend even further than the novel. And it sounds like what you do offers a lot of offers another avenue for people to explore what else they might want to look into in terms of Mary Ronan. So yeah, so that's great. It's a nice connection. I'm glad.
It is. Yeah, and history is storytelling. And so we try to tell stories in a way that is interesting, much like you do with historical fiction. And historical fiction is such a great entry into history, a great way to bring those stories alive to life in a really fascinating way. And I love that book too that you mentioned, The Girl from the Gulches by Ellen Baumler, who edited the book.
Right.
And Ellen is an amazing historian, and she's really someone I've learned a lot from in that on how to tell stories about these women. And so it was really, and I read her book a long time ago. Girl from the Gulches is kind of
there it is.
And I read this book a long time ago. So it was so nice to read your book, because it fills in all those gaps. It really, fills in.
It's speculative, of course, because yeah.
And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later, kind of what was speculative and what was fact. But you talked a little bit about what brought you to writing books about historical women, but what really brought you to history? What is your, how did you get interested in history and writing about historical characters and writing historical fiction?
Well, I didn't take a single history class in college, I have to confess. And I really didn't think I was interested in all that much in history, although I loved, as a young reader, the Ingalls Wilder series or the Caddy Woodlawn series. I grew up in Wisconsin. And I was, beg my parents to take me to the home sites of characters that I read about if they were within driving distance. And I can remember one Sunday afternoon in a snowstorm, my dad trying to find Caddy Woodlawn's house, and finally he just said, "That's it." And then we turned around and went home. But so I obviously had an interest, but I was very, he was very selective. But when my husband and I, when we left, we used to live in Bend before we live in Bend now. So, but we were in Bend, and we had made a decision to move to what I called Rattlesnake and Rock Ranch in the 80s. It was just it was property along the John Day River, which is a wild and scenic river. And there was nothing there. And we just quit our jobs and we made this decision to go up there. And while we were trying to build a life there, I read a history in, in the local history society, an essay that was written by a man who is now in his 80s, but the essay had won a contest when he was in the 3rd grade. And it was about this couple who were trying to build a life on another river in Oregon, the Deschutes River, and their relationship with the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute people. And that happened to be the Confederated tribes that I was working for, part-time while we were building our ranch. And it was just a wonderfully written piece about living well with your neighbors. And I said to my husband, well, somebody should write that story, because and the native side had never been written down there. And all I'd been able to get was that little piece. And then I found her obituary. Jane, her name is Jane Sheehan. I found her obituary, and it was so evocative about the relationship she had with the native people. And that intrigued me. Well, what went on that they loved her so dearly and came to her wake and so on. And so I kept saying, somebody needs to write this. It can't be me, because I'd never written fiction, and it wasn't my family, and I hadn't lived in the community for 150 years, so, and my husband said, if you think it's a great story, you should just write it down. And if people don't like your version, they can write their own. And so I thought, well, when would I do this? And I thought, well, all I had been doing between 4 and 7 in the morning was sleeping. So I thought I would set the alarm at 4, and I would my commitment was to be at the computer by 5. And then I'd have 2 hours every day to write. And the next day we went to a historical society meeting in a little town in Oregon. And I sat next to a man who said to me, and what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm a writer. It was just like, and he said, oh, what are you working on? I said, oh, I'm writing the story of Jane and Joseph Shear and their life with the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute people. And he said, I hadn't written one sentence yet at that point. But he said, you should meet my cousin. And I asked him why. And he said, because she owns the original property that their homestead was on. And then I realized I'm working for this tribe, and I can probably find some elders, and I did. And I realized that even though I hadn't yet written a sentence, I'd done the hardest work, because I'd made this commitment to tell this story. And I wanted to tell it as a biography, but I could not find out anything really more about her. I could find things about her husband, her brother, her father. And if there'd been a son, I know I would have been able to find that too. And that's been the pattern of all of these different women that I've written about. And so it just became for me a passion to try to recover lost stories and to tell it from a woman's point of view, we might not otherwise know what was going on in their lives, but also because they really lived. The stories, I think, take on a different kind of meaning, and people will tell me, at least, that for me, when I'm writing, I'm always saying, where did they draw their strength from? Where did they get what they needed to climb up the ladder? A friend of mine wrote and said, we all get into a cellar of sorrow, and then we have to climb up the rungs of the ladder. And so I'm always looking, as I'm writing, what are the rungs of the ladder that gave this woman what she needed to be able to endure the incredible disasters and disappointments that are really part of the history of the West, but also part of our history in a contemporary world.
Right. Wonderful. Well, that's great that you
just story.
dived into it. I know that you just dived in and said, that first day, I'm a writer.
Yes. Well, that was, I'd written nonfiction articles at that point, and I had written a memoir called Homestead, which is the story of our making this decision to leave suburbia and move to this place. But that was the first time I answered that question without a disclaimer. I'm a writer, and I am, I guess.
Yeah,
So yeah.
Yes. Oh,
I
that's
love it
wonderful.
when I've done classes in schools, like especially in that third and fourth grade, that era, that age group, and I'll do little writers classes, and and the kids, I just get so excited when they leave and go and talk to their teacher and say, I'm a writer," and they absolutely are. So it's
Yeah.
great
Oh,
joy.
that's wonderful. So, um, when you're writing these novels and when you're writing this historical fiction, how do you dive into these women's lives? And you talked a little bit about that, but can you talk a little bit more about the research that you do to try to uncover as much as you can? Do you read diaries? Do you visit these places where they lived or where they spent lots of time? And for this book, uh, about Mary Ronan, what were your most important resources?
So I actually, what I call the work before the work.
Yeah.
So before I get an idea for a story, I think I want to write about this particular one about Mary, and I will spend quite a bit of time writing and answering three questions. And the three questions are from a book called Structuring Your Novel. And the three questions, the first one is, what's my intention? And that actually is like the elevator question. You know, you're on the elevator and somebody says, "Oh, you're a writer. What are you working on?" You've got one floor, you know, so it's just, you get to be a one-liner. And then the second question is, what's my attitude towards this story? And the corollary to that is, what do I feel deeply about in wanting to tell this story? And the third question is, what's my purpose in writing this book? And the corollary to that is, how do I hope a reader might be changed in the telling of this story? And I might take, you know, many, many pages of trying to write that out. But I try to get it down to one sentence each. And then I put those three sentences on the top of my computer.
Nice.
And then when I get halfway through and think, "Oh, this is the worst decision I've ever made. This will never go anywhere." It's, you know, I call it the muddle in the middle. I can look up there and say, "Okay, this is what this book is about. This is why you cared about this story. And this is what you hope that the reader will take away." This is, you know, so that having been finished, those sort of three questions, I will then start to do a timeline, try to identify the important events in this woman's life. And, you know, of course, I used her memoir. That was really helpful. The work that Peter's, her husband Peter's reports that were published by University of Montana, I think if I remember it right, who published it. Many of us have good farms, and the other one about justice. That was wonderful material, and made, you know, that was material that I could sort of collaborate with her, particularly after they married and went to the Jocko Agency. Then I could collaborate those two pieces of information. I spoke with some local writers from Montana who wrote nonfiction. I especially like to talk to people who are involved in fish and game and wildlife work, because they're very good observers, and they can remember detail. One of the best resources I had when I wrote a book about a woman out of Florida was a man who wrote a book called My 50 Years of Hunting in the Everglades, and it was like the best book in the world to get those details about how people travel to the Everglades. So I spoke with someone who had written several nonfiction books, and also wrote about the local flora and fauna of Montana. Because I knew that she had had contact with Libby Custer. I read books about Libby Custer and her movement through the West. I'm trying to think of some of the others. And then just a lot of I went online to the Pend Oreille and the other native websites. because it was COVID, I couldn't travel as much as I would have liked to. So that was, an issue. But I also had, friends who are Montanans who it turned out as they knew that I was interested in telling this story. And Carrie Huskett, who lives in Kalispell, actually went to a family history seminar and got lots of data and information for me. And so I had people locally who were Montanans. And then it seemed like when I told people that I was working on this story, I found all these people who they come from Montana. I mean, I never knew that about them. And so that was great to explore that. If I tried to find descendants, but I was not able to do that. Usually I try to do that with the story that I told you about earlier, which is that book, by the way, was called The Sweetness to the Soul. And I could, talking to descendants is just a rich experience because there's a reason why certain stories are remembered and passed down through the generations. And even though sometimes I'll talk to two sisters or a sister and a brother and have a different take on the family story, but that story was powerful enough that both siblings, or both great-great-grandchildren remembered the story. And so that helps me sort of shape the character and shape, was this, again, another really important event in this woman's life. So then I tried to make a timeline so that I can look at what was going on for that woman and identify the highlights. And of course, for Mary, it was, part of the confusion of her early life, traveling around, not being sure where she was. And then, coming to Montana, settling down, and then her dad would move them. And of course, the big move to San Juan Capistrano and then coming back. And so I'm always looking for, then I will read the history of San Capistrano, what was going on during those time periods. I'm also looking for what else was going on in the world. So even though I have a timeline for the main characters, I'm also looking at what else was happening and when would they have known about the Lincoln assassination, for example, or how would they have been affected by Reconstruction, even though they were in Montana, and those kinds of things. And then I have to try to match those up and identify. A lot of times those details are just become small moments in the interaction, but they hopefully give some depth to the storyline. And sometimes the depth is, I get corrected, which is wonderful. Ellen graciously agreed to read the manuscript and just was so helpful. I'm just so grateful to her. But all of the readers that I had that were Montana readers commented on my line that said, I had some line that said, Helena and May is balmy. And so they all said, no, we don't have balmy in our conversation about the weather
not usually,
in the spring.
No,
not usually. So it was so funny because, everybody from Montana who saw that line was like, okay, I'm Xing that one.
I got to get rid of that one.
Get rid of that one. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Balmy is not a word we use in Montana. No. For sure. Jane, sorry to interrupt. Do you have, there's some audio feedback that's happening. Do you have any background TV or anything going?
Do. You want to turn that off, Terry?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we didn't think you could hear it, but you can hear it. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Is that better? Is that better now?
Better. That is much better. Yeah.
Good. That's good.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. No.
So yeah, well, that's always good to have that, to have some of that feedback and to have others read through, and I'm sure that's always nice. And then of course, probably when you start talking about what you're writing, you do have a lot of help from people who have researched that subject or who know something about that subject. So that's great as well. So let's just dive in and talk a little bit more about Mary, or Mollie Ronan, as you call her in the book, and a little bit about her life and why you decided to write about her. What was, you talked a little bit about that before, but really what interested you most about Mollie and why you decided to spend the time to write this particular book.
So I'd say there were two main things. One was that I saw her as an ordinary woman who probably saw herself as an ordinary woman who just wanted to be a wife and a mom and look after her world around her. And in fact, the working title that I had for the book was called Always an Open Door. And it was, I felt like her sense of hospitality, that was something that I had not explored in any other books about the West. And yet that was such a pivotal thing for women in particular who might not see another person for a really long time, and then how they were so gracious. I felt that there was this the blend of other cultures and her willingness to learn about the other cultures and to learn Salish and to learn how to be as the wife of an agent. And I'd done enough reading and enough. I had just completed a book, The Healing of Natalie Curtis, which was about the Code of Offenses of 1883, which happened, after Mollie and Peter. They never had to live with that, but it was clear that there were people who were trying to eliminate the cultures of Native people at that point, and it was such a stark position that the Ronans had no interest in that. They had an interest in supporting and celebrating the Native people and treating them with dignity and respect. And that was the way in which the tribes that I worked with had remembered some of the Native, some of the pioneering people that they had the greatest respect for, was that sense of hospitality, but also that they were treated with dignity and respect. And so I wanted to explore that, to tell that story. And then the other part was what I saw as somewhat of her, in some ways it was a curse that she put on herself to honor her father. That in the fictional account I have, that's partly coming from her mother's death wish, that she be kind and that she honor her father, and she was a woman of faith, very deep and devout Catholic faith, and so honoring your father in the fourth commandment would have been really important for her. And at the same time, she described some behaviors of her father that were so incredibly controlling, and I wanted to explore how it was that she finally broke free from that. But in many ways, it's really a story about a father and a daughter and their relationship, and especially, of course, when she falls in love with Peter, who used to be her father's best friend, and his great reluctance and hostility, and so much so that he moved the entire family out of Montana to try to break up this relationship. And then how fate intervenes, and so they rediscover each other, and I just felt like there were these small little moments that really were precious in how they reestablished, and it was a great love story, and I figured we needed a good love story. I needed to write about a good love story after writing about the terrible Code of Offenses and the destruction of Native tribes. So yeah, so those are the two things, that great sense of hospitality and how that made its way out in the Western experience, especially Montana, and her own relationship with her father.
Yeah. And I love how you say that she was just an ordinary person, and she felt like she was such an ordinary person. But of course, we see her life as extraordinary.
Exactly.
When you read this book and you read about her life, it's she does these things. She kind of follows this historical West trajectory in such a close way. And so, and she meets all these people. It's kind of like someone wrote that her life was like a who's who of Montana at that time.
Yeah, exactly. Yes,
Because
and the
of all the
representatives,
people.
and and then her husband being such a political animal, and a journalist, and so they had just these great. Well, and then he was into mining, and so it's that picture of how Montana developed. I mean, Montana has such a fascinating history throughout the era and the period, and so I was learning a lot while I was going, and hoping I didn't like totally forget some major thing that happened in Montana that I just skipped over, but because there was so much that happened, and they were in the middle of it.
They were
through the whole time. Yeah.
And it's a great, her life was such a great life to write about, to really explore the history of Montana territory and Montana, and her living in Virginia City at such a crucial time, and then in Helena. And then, of course, living on the Indian Agency at the Flathead or the Jocko Indian Agency really highlights a part of history that we don't often hear about, we don't often know about. So we often hear about the gold rush town of Virginia City and Helena, and the miners in Helena, and that part of that early Montana history. But we don't often hear about the native side of that, the indigenous peoples part in this story in depth. And I loved, that was one of the parts of your book that I really loved, is you really dug into some of that and really focused on Peter and Mollie's time at the Flathead Indian Agency. So Peter became the agent at the Flathead or Jocko Indian Agency, and they lived there for many, many years. I think you said 17 years.
It was 17 years,
17 years. And
so
Peter,
and
Peter served as the agent of the Confederated Salish, Ponderay, and Kootenai nations at the Flathead Indian Agency. And this was such a critical time in Montana's history, because of course these treaties were being signed, and our indigenous nations were being put on reservations, and these agencies were being formed all over the state of Montana. And it was a place where cultures came together. Of course, it was places where these nations came together with the employees of these agencies, which were often employed by the U.S. government. And so Peter and Mollie lived at this agency, and they were witnessing a time when indigenous people were losing their culture, were losing their land, and were losing pretty much their entire lifestyle. And so they witnessed this, and it really affected them. But also they were participants in this because they were employed by the US government, who was doing this. And so can you just talk a little bit about, this is complex history, Jane, I tell you what, and you tackled it and I loved it. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
I think that, one of the things that makes this story really intriguing is that Peter came to that position with a set of skills. He was somewhat of a diplomat in many ways. He helped McGinnis get elected. Ellen, helped me really understand that he was considered a Union Democrat. So there were a lot of people, Confederate supporters, who had come to Montana, and he'd come to Montana about that time, but that he was a supporter of the Union, which made him, but he was from the South, so that made him, somewhat unique. But he learned to live with that. To balance that. He was, I think, very much of a negotiator, very much of a peacemaker in his general life, and he was, his capacity to observe through his journalistic interests, I think, and abilities, made him a really good reporter for accuracy as opposed to taking sides as he was reporting back to the federal government. And I think those were skills that were really important at a time of great transition. He also quickly grasped the changes that were going on for the native peoples, and in particular the buffalo hunting and the critical getting ammunition for that at a time and wars were going on, and there was this fear in terms of the white settlers of armed Indians, and they had trouble distinguishing between Indians who had made the decision to live associated with the agency. Many of them had ranches and were very successful farmers long before Peter ever came to the agency. And but the ability to sort of coordinate that, maneuver through that, and then convincing the federal government that they needed ammunition and that they needed this in order to provide enough food for their families. And if that didn't happen, then the government needed to provide more food, and he'd have to deal with these traders. And all of that going on without, through many different languages, and then without the benefit of the internet. So you had to communicate in a very delayed fashion and manage that part too. So I think that sort of picture that he brought to the agency. But when I read the letter that he sent back to Mollie, he went on ahead to see whether or not this was going to be a job he was interested in. And he writes this letter back to her to tell her to sell everything except this, and this, and that she is going to love this place. And he describes the great, not only the beauty, but the feeling of hospitality that he experienced coming there to the agency, and what the possibilities were, that all of his life work in some ways came together by being a good agent and a skilled agent, that his attitude about life was very upbeat, was very positive, and it was very much focused on community. And so I think that helped him deal with a variety of issues between the native tribes, and there were old wounds, and there were old stories. And I know when I worked on the reservation, I learned very early never to gossip, because I might be telling a story about someone who happened to be the stepdaughter of this other person. It's like, because there were lots of interrelationships and intermarriages. And so I think that enabled him to make his way through these really difficult, tense times. But they arrived in June of, let's say, 1876, and Chief Joseph had already left and had already been killing people as he resisted, the decision to go onto the reservation that the military had cut him off. And Peter really was very sympathetic towards Chief Joseph, and tried to get the government to recognize that they had defaulted, and that was why this was happening. And for that to go on, and he quickly grasped that, I think, and for that to go on, and for that to happen within the first few months of them being at the agency, was pretty remarkable, that they survived that, and that they managed that well. And he maintained a relationship. He tried to get Chief Joseph to be able to come to the Jocko agency, and to, I'd live out his life there. But the government was adamant that no, he couldn't get any benefit. And ultimately, many years later, he got to go to the Colville Reservation. And it just struck me that while I was doing that research and writing about it, a friend sent me an article about in Joseph, Oregon, that the band of Nez Perce that Chief Joseph was associated with had purchased back I think it was 418 acres of what had been the original reservation, and that they now owned back, this small percentage, but it belonged to them. And I love that happened while I was writing about him and about this war and the interactions between Native people and non-Indians. So, it's like the history it's way back when, but it's still present, still with us.
Right. Because things that happened to Peter and Mollie and at this agency, the ramifications are still happening today.
Yes.
It's not that long ago. If you think about it. Yeah. It is an ancient history, that's for sure. So at this time while they were at the agency, Mollie in the book has a friend named Shows No Anger. And I love this friendship. And can you talk a little bit about if this friendship really existed in real life? And then if it didn't, why you developed this relationship?
So I'm sure it existed in real life. But I'm sure she had a different name. So Shows No Anger was just appeared at a time when I felt that was just perfect. That because I believed she would have had a Native friend that was close enough to tell her about the intimacies and the small little things that she might have done. And part of this is because of my own experience for working 17 years with 3 different tribes. And I had someone, 2 or 3 different women who I called my cultural brokers, that I would, something would happen in an interaction with a family, and I would know that I had done something wrong because I could tell by the look on their face or by the way they turned away from me. But I didn't know what I'd done. And so I had friends that I could go to and say, this is what happened. This is what I observed. What went on here? How did I offend? And they would tell me, and I think that Mollie would have needed that. And because she was so beloved, where they wanted to give their name to one of their children. One of the chiefs, when they heard that she was going to travel to California, they sent an envoy to be able to, protect her during the journey to, get the stage. And that kind of care, to me, would not have happened to someone who had offended and who didn't seem to mind, if you can put it that way. So I think she would have been very, in order to earn that kind of respect and care, she had to have someone who could have helped her make amends, because we all, in another culture, we always do things that we don't know that we did it. And she might have known that she did it, but didn't know what it was by the reaction. So I needed to have her have a woman named, someone, and Shows No Anger was the perfect kind of personality, I think, who was willing to confront her about various things, but also they shared lives as mothers, and they shared lives as wives, and they all both had interesting fathers to contend with as well. So I think she would have had a relationship like that, even though it was a fictional creation of that. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. I was like, I want to know more, but I'm watching the time click down. So I just want to start by saying thank you.
Thank you. Great questions, Crystal.
The first questions we have from the audience is, Jane, if you wouldn't mind just repeating yourself about the three questions that you start with for your creative process.
Right. So the first question is, what is my intention? And that's, one liner like, this is a story about a young woman and her relationship with her father. That would be my growing up in Montana. What do I feel deeply about? And what I felt deeply about in this story was, or what is my attitude, but it's like, what do I feel deeply about? And what I felt deeply about was this relationship between a father and her daughter, and a relationship between a husband and a wife, and how those sometimes, clash, and then how to live in the sandwich generation, I call it, where you've got your parents you have to worry about, and you've got your children and your family, your own family to worry about. And then the third section, or the third question, is, what's my purpose? And the corollary is, how do I hope a reader might be changed? And I really hope that if people read this book, that they would be inspired by the ordinary life. That sometimes we're so, particularly women, are compelled, like, we've got to do something, we've got to be remarkable, whatever. And Mollie was remarkable from the observation of people around her, but I think she didn't see herself as being extraordinary. And my hope is that people might read this book and go, my sister is like that. She's just a remarkable woman. That's that my friend. And maybe they might even look at themselves and say, I'm a good mom. I'm a good wife. I care about my community. I care about my family. And that's enough. I don't have to do something remarkable. That's remarkable enough. So that's my hope.
I love that. Remarkable enough.
Exactly.
Shelley, I did type those out as Jane was speaking and put them in the chat as well. I know you were trying to get it down for your own edification.
Yes.
So Shelley, if you missed it the second time around, look in the chat there, and hopefully you can just copy paste. There's also a really beautiful note from Jennifer, who says, I just want to say thank you to Jane and Crystal. As a longtime Oregonian, I've been reading your books for a long time, Jane, and love them, but living here in Bozeman now, I'm anxious to read this one. So
great.
It's always wonderful to be able to draw those correlations and connections across space and time, even as we do that presently and also in your writing. So Leslie is curious, how do you craft the gaps in biography, and is there a pattern to your approach?
In biography or fiction? In fiction, you make it up. You create scenes or tensions of some kind that, in those gaps. When I'm doing the research and I'm looking, and I've realized that there are long periods of time, and there are certainly periods of time when Mollie was in San Juan Capistrano that we don't know what she was doing. It's limited discussion, but she does tell us about some of the social life she had. She tells us about her father's farming. She talks a little bit about her stepmother during that time. And so what I did was just extrapolate from that. Okay, would there have been tension with her partying and going off, as she was being wrapped up into the life of the San Juan Capistrano and trying to forget Peter? Would her father supported that, or would there have been some tension with that? And then explore those pieces to sort of move the story forward, but always looking at the three sentences at the top of my computer. What's this about? That sort of thing. Yeah.
At the beginning of speaking today, you've mentioned, women's history is something that has to be kind of uncovered and dug around, and I feel made up.
Yeah, that's what Virginia Woolf said. a difficult Virginia world. Yeah.
And I feel like that's often true as well for the various minorities that are left out of the narrative. And so I'm curious if there was a piece of that history that you maybe didn't have to make up, but didn't quite make it into the book. Because it didn't, you just couldn't quite fit that puzzle piece in there. And it got left on the editing floor, as it were.
I would have liked to have had time to, and the presence to actually talk to some elders who probably have stories of the Ronans. I can't believe they wouldn't. I really wanted to know if there was any conversation that got handed down about when when the lake was named for Mary, and when the mountain was named for Peter, because there would have been native words, there would have been native names for those places. And here in Oregon, we've been reworking a lot of the names that use the derogatory, word for Native women, and so the naming, group has been changing those using Native, so now we have Wasatch, Waichus Creek instead of that other word, and the mountain has been renamed and so on. And I think I would have liked to have known, and maybe I could have interviewed. I'm sure there's probably a Montana naming society of some kind. I probably should have gotten a hold of them to see if there was anything in the record, because I think that would have been interesting. But I made it Mary's Reservation, that she saw it as a gift her husband wanted to give her, this name of the lake after her, but that I had her hesitate and not be sort of like full force, oh, how wonderful, because she would have known that the Native people had another name. How would they feel that, once again, people had come in from outside and usurped that? So those kinds of things, I would have loved to have had more access. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Crystal, what I feel like the Extreme History Project does a lot of work with the Gallatin History Museum, just a stone's throw from the country bookshelf here, and a lot of the other sort of record-keeping bodies in Western Montana. And so I'm curious if you see a place for this, for Beneath the Bending Skies, alongside some of the other stories that we tell about this area, and how that fits into the sort of public perception of the history of Montana.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great story. And like I said, I really liked the way that you wrote it, Jane, because you brought in the complexity of this family, living on the reservation and having these two cultures kind of come together, not in a colliding way, but in a healing way. And that's, of course, what we're moving towards now, is trying to heal this trauma, heal this historical trauma that has happened. And how do we do that? And the way that we do that is by building relationship. And so, if it wasn't COVID when you were writing this book, I'm sure you would have gone and talked to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai elders. And that's how we build community, and that's how we heal, and that's how we move forward. And so, but we also have to look at this history, this hard history, this history that no one really wants to look at, because it's not fun history, it's awful history. But we have to look at it and understand it, and then process it in all these different ways. And, I think historical fiction is one way to do that, is to process these traumas that have happened. And so, so that's what I liked about it, is that you talked about the Ronans, and how they were part of this process, that this Indian agency that was not, it was a really, it was a place where they were trying to assimilate these native nations into farmers and get rid of their cultural traditions. But yet Mary Ronan and Peter were trying to kind of work around that to keep some of these traditions, but yet were just so incredibly sad to see what was happening, what was playing out in front of them. And I think you really got that across, that they were seeing these nations being torn apart. So I love this book. I thought it was wonderful. I can't wait to read your book about Natalie Curtis. But I just wanted to point out your quote on your website too that I pulled off that I really love. It says, I like helping people from the distant past step from their generation into our own to teach and touch us with their lives. And that's, of course, the mission of the Extreme History Project too, is to look at this history to make it relevant today, to better understand ourselves and our lives and our community and how we can help each other move forward. So I really love that in the way that you brought these people to life, all the characters in the book. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for that comment. I appreciate that.
Well, we are about at our time. So I want to say thank you both so much for joining us here and sharing these stories. It doesn't escape me that we are also 3 female presenting people on the screen talking about some of these buried, untold stories. And so it's a pleasure and a privilege.
That's a tongue twister, isn't it?
A little bit. I don't know how those Oscar speeches get away with it.
Yeah.
But if you haven't picked up a copy of Beneath the Bending Skies, again, there is a link in the chat to do so. We have copies here at the store. If you are local to Bozeman, come on down and pick one up. And we're hoping that we'll get some signed book plates from Jane here in the next week or so.
Them yesterday.
So if you want to wait for that to come in, we're happy to hold copies for you until those arrive. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Jane and Crystal, for your time today. And I hope we get to, we 3 can meet again in the future for the next one.
I hope so too. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you, everyone. Have
right.
a great night.
Great evening.